Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Murray. And I'm pleased to be here with you today. And as much as anything, I see what I'm doing as getting a reality check on my views of the Saskatchewan Lake Diefenbake irrigation. What I'm going to do is share my screen, and we'll hope that works. And if it doesn't, Mara will bail me out and we'll use the slides that she has. So I'll try the screen sharing now. I'm not sure if people can see that or not. Maybe someone can
Yeah,
give.
yeah,
Okay,
that looks great.
okay, that's super. Okay, I'll try not to mess it up now, but I've got it right. So anyway, yes, thanks again for the invitation, and I'll just move through some slides and we'll take it from there. What I'd like to do is today is talk a little bit about, call it a history or a chronology of some things related to irrigation in Saskatchewan. Then I want to raise some of the issues I see with the irrigation proposal, and they can basically fall into public policy, economics, and environmental assessment. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks. And I'm quite serious as I go through. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask the audience, and I hope that would prompt some discussion at the end of my talk. Just looking at the history, some of this is, I'm sure, is very familiar to all of you, but I think it's worth stepping through it quickly. And of course, you know, Lake Diefenbake was opened officially in 1967. And at that time, it was considered a multi-purpose reservoir. And, you know, with the idea of providing municipal water, industrial water, irrigation, recreation, hydropower generation. And I think the important point to note is that the South Saskatchewan River and the North Saskatchewan River are really the only reliable sources of water in southern Saskatchewan, because when you're on those rivers, you're actually seeing something like 80 to 90% mountain runoff, and that's what makes the flow so reliable. And that project did anticipate some 500,000 acres of irrigation, and I should also say, though, that there was a royal commission that the province used to try and generate federal funding for this project. And the royal commission said, well, irrigation, maybe yes, maybe no. They didn't have a firm position on it at the time. And so that was an interesting sidebar in the whole thing at that time. In 1973, the government of the day actually suspended irrigation development from Lake Diefenbake, and I suspect the reason was the lack of take up, or relatively little take up. And that continued for another decade. And then in the mid 80s, there was an agreement, please don't ask me what SIBED stands for, Saskatchewan Irrigation something or other developments, I'm sure. But there was $100 million federal provincial project aimed at, in effect, subsidizing the online costs of farmers to get them to take up irrigation. And when you think about it, $100 million in the mid 80s is worth about $250 million today. So this was a very significant investment, and yet nothing much happened. And so even today, the amount of irrigation from Lake Diefenbake is about 110,000 acres. So and there's always been this notion of, you know, we should develop the whole scope of the project and that sort of thing. If you step forward another decade, and there was a study called Water Wealth, which was uh, touted as a 50-year water development plan for Saskatchewan. And that study covered everything but the phase of the moon, but it did include the idea of a diversion down towards the Capel River to increase irrigation in that area. What's interesting about that study, if you can find it, is that it had a whole bunch of projections of water use in Saskatchewan, and none of which have come true. You know, it said there's going to be this expansion for municipal purposes, so we need water in Regina, we need more diversion. There'd be all these potash mines that would demand more water, and on it went. But if you look at the water use projections in that report and compare them to what the use is today, nothing much happened, because people have got smarter about using water, and they're using less, not more. Then we come to a couple of years later, the Saskatchewan Irrigation Projects Association put out a report called A Time to Irrigate. And again, it was trying to get to that 500,000 acre project. And you skip forward another few years, and then we have an Upper Capel water supply study. And that was talking about irrigating 100,000 acres towards the Capel Valley and spending about $1 billion. And then more recently, Western Economic Diversification, a federal agency, put out a report called Prairie Prosperity, and it was kind of at 500,000 acres, $3.2 billion of expenditure. And then finally, there was a provincial announcement in July of a 500,000 acre project and a $4 billion expenditure. So that's a very brief summary of the development of irrigation in Saskatchewan. And this project that the province announced is, you can see the general idea in the map. Phase one relates to the kind of the area that would use the existing unused West Side Canal. And it was touted to be 80,000 acres of development at a cost of $500,000. And then you can see in the area going up towards Asquith and in the north of that, the extension of that west side development. And that would be a further 260,000 acres. And then finally, phase three, which is basically between Lake Diefenbaker and Buffalo Pound Lake, would be another 120,000 acres. And they don't give a price for phase two and phase three separately, but basically it makes up the $3.5 billion to get to $4 billion. So this is what's been proposed. And of course, people like me have some concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, my concerns fall into three categories. And what I'll do is just step through those categories. And of course, the public policy aspect from my perspective is that this project is touted as a regional economic development project. It's not really, it's described, of course, in irrigation terms, but it's, its claim to fame is regional economic development. And of course, the province being broke, it's entirely debt financed, and they are trying to get federal support for the project. And one of the things that's been pointed out is that this is the largest single project investment in the history of Saskatchewan. And the question that comes to me immediately is, if you're going to spend $4 billion on regional economic development, what else did you consider doing? And of course, I think we know the answer to that, but I think it's still a very key question. And then the other part of it is that I just have deep troubles with what I'd call the social equity aspects of this. They're talking about $4 billion for a few hundred farmers to develop irrigation when we have more than 40,000 dryland farmers in the province. And I guess, the question I would have for those listening, and I'd like your ideas at the end, is, can you think of other farm-related projects that would spend vast amounts of money and would serve the province more adequately? And so it's just I can think of certainly lots of ways of spending billions of dollars that would benefit Saskatchewan, but I'd like to see what the sense is of how it would benefit the farm community and rural communities in general. In terms of the economics, the benefits are always touted in irrigation projects in Saskatchewan as diversifying crop production, increasing on-farm profitability, drawing in value-added processing, and then there's always especially now what people are talking about climate change, there's always an angle related to drought-proofing the farm community, and those are usually the advertised benefits of any big irrigation project. And of course, a big project like that has costs to the tune of $4 billion, but there are other costs as well. And we have to consider the loss of hydroelectric generation, because if you take water out of Lake Diefenbaker, that's water that won't be used to generate electricity right through Saskatchewan and down to Hudson Bay. And the SEPA report, the Time to Irrigate report, mentions in that report, of all places, that the biggest single economic value of Lake Diefenbaker to date is the generation of hydroelectricity. So, even SEPA recognizes that, and it seems somehow perverse to me to be decreasing hydroelectricity generation at a time when climate change is talking about using more renewables. And so that's that's certainly a factor in itself. There are all kinds of environmental factors, which I will talk about more, but I've lumped them under ecosystem impacts as a cost of this project. And there are reduced recreational opportunities as well, because the project has challenges for Lake Diefenbaker regulation, downstream flows, and so on. And then the project itself has impacts on dryland farming, because it's in effect taking farmland out of production for, in order to create canals and distribution systems and so on. And I also think of it as a cost of, if attention is focused on irrigation, then it's not focused on dryland farming. So there are a number of economic wrinkles in all of this. And, this challenge of economics and irrigation in Saskatchewan is a really key point. And, the irrigation to date in this province has led to continued irrigation of dryland crops. We don't really see the lettuce farms and all these other things that we should see in this if irrigation development is going to work for the province economically. And there's very little evidence of value-added processing in this province. And I wonder, as a technical person, I wanted to mention drought proofing, because um, it's often seen that irrigation as a drought proofing measure, but in effect, this new irrigation development would acquire water licenses from the province, and all water uses have to be licensed in this province, like Prairie Canada as a whole. And it's as you'll see later in my talk, the amount of water available is such that it's highly unlikely that an irrigator would receive a license that would allow them to irrigate every year. The license would really be couched in something like 8 years in 10, you could count on having some water, because in the dry years, there's not enough water to meet these junior licenses. And then my mind goes to the idea that if 8 years in 10, you have enough water to irrigate, probably 2 of those years, there's so much rain you don't need to irrigate. So you're asking people to invest millions of dollars in irrigation equipment and probably have useful water about 6 years in 10 at the most. So there's a really a challenge to me as to just how economically feasible that would be. But the question I would like to ask the group again is, what do they see, or what do you see as the things that are inhibiting uh, this rosy future of irrigation in Saskatchewan? I suspect it's largely on-farm economics, but I'd really like to have your input on the things that cause farmers not to take up irrigation. And but at any rate, on the economic side, what I would advocate for is a Saskatchewan-orientated benefit cost analysis of this irrigation development. And all the documents that Saskatchewan and others have produced on irrigation in Saskatchewan always talk about irrigation development in Alberta, irrigation development in the Great Plains of the US, irrigation development all around the world, and they describe that in economic terms, but I've never seen a study that looks at irrigation in Saskatchewan and offer some comments on that. And specifically, I would like to see a study based on the $250 million equivalent that was spent in the 80s on the SIBED agreement, and just see what that $250 million led to in value-added processing and diversification and so on. I'd like to spend a few minutes and just talk about the quantity of water we're talking about in this project. And it's a considerable amount of water. And I don't think you really need to know the numbers. You just have to get the message. And but 500,000 acres of irrigation. Irrigators talk about the amount of water they would apply on an acre of land, and they call that the duty. And so it would be reasonable to expect an irrigator to get an entitlement to apply 1 foot of water on each acre of that irrigated property. Some irrigation licenses do call for a 1.5 foot duty, but those of you at farm have a good idea of how much water you need to grow a decent crop, and but it's usually 1 foot to 1.5. And I then converted that amount of water to metric units because that's what I tend to work in, and so that becomes 600,000 cubic decameters, and a cubic decameter is just 1,000 cubic meters. It's a lazy way for me to avoid writing a bunch more zeros. That's all it is. So, but it's just 1,000 cubic meters. But then if you look at the typical amount of water that Saskatchewan's entitled to receive from Alberta in what I'd call a normal flow year, it's about 5.5 million cubic decameters. And so 600,000 against 5.5 million, that doesn't look too dismal, but keep in mind that of that 5.5 million cubic decameters, Saskatchewan is required to send half of that downstream to Manitoba. So you have to compare 600,000 to something like 275 million cubic decameters. And then if you then say, well, what's the lowest Lake Diefenbaker inflow in history? And you find that 1,700, there's 1.7 million cubic decameters, half of which should go to Manitoba. So then you're looking about 850,000 cubic decameters of water, and a water demand potentially of 600,000. And you can see why I could say the province is unlikely to license use of all that irrigation water in a junior license in a dry year. It's just not going to happen. And so the numbers are large, and the in a normal year, yes, there is water available to irrigate, but in a dry year, there really isn't. The other way you can look at this quantity of water is assuming it's used in irrigation. Um, that if you drew water for irrigation over 100 days, that's 70 cubic meters per second of water coming out of Lake Diefenbaker. And it's kind of interesting to compare that to the minimum flow. It's not an absolute minimum. You could go lower, but it's what they call a target release for water at Saskatoon, and which is 42.5 roughly cubic meters per second. So again, this is a very large amount of water. There's no way you can slice it without coming to that conclusion. And so we have to be really diligent in assessing the water use and making sure that we uh, do this carefully and thoroughly. If we then turn to environmental assessment, there are many different ways of looking at the needs of environmental assessment, but in effect, I like to speak about, with any water diversion, what are the effects on the basins that lose water, and then what are the effects in the areas that gain water? And so we talk about donor basins and recipient basins. And of course, the water that flows downstream of Gardner Dam right through to Manitoba would be reduced because they're giving up water to the Capel system and the West Side Canal area. And of course, the Capel and the West Side are what I'd call recipient basins. But before we even talk about those, we have to consider the effects of this on Lake Diefenbaker itself. And as you extract that much more water from Lake Diefenbaker, water level management becomes a more considerable issue. And, there are recreation uses on the lake. You have kind of the interesting ecological problem of supporting nesting piping plover during the spring runoff, and countless other sort of water level management challenges related to Lake Diefenbaker. And then almost by virtue alone of reducing the amount of water in the lake, it poses challenges for nutrient management as well for that lake. And certainly if there were irrigation return flows going into the lake, which I don't think is a huge issue, but that could be an issue in itself and in prompting nutrient issues. So the lake management itself becomes a problem. And then downstream, there are just a host of potential environmental problems. And first you have the effect of reduced flows on all the trees and woody growth along the river itself. And then of course that riverside trees and bush provide habitat for any number of species. So that's an issue in itself, and a sort of loss of habitat. There have been challenges related to fish spawning because of reduced flows downstream. You have water quality effects. If nothing else, you have potential effects on water quality because of reduced flows, and which provides less dilution for some of the pollutants that are in the river now. And then you have a number of sort of small irrigators, and you have the people between Lake Diefenbaker and Saskatoon who actually do grow vegetables and sell them in local markets. And, they have to adjust all their irrigation systems to accommodate the lower flows. You have recreational issues due to lower levels. So there are a host of those sort of summer effects if water is taken out in the summertime. And then if you reduce the flows in the winter because you want to keep the lake level higher, so that you have a lake with some quantity of water in the spring, then you end up with effects on ice growth and ice breakup and all of that in the winter as well. And reduced flows in the river would tend to lead to reduced uh, or more chance of ice jams and that sort of thing. And of course, Sask Power generates most of its electricity in the winter because that's the peak time for using electricity in this province. And so there's, has effect that way as well. But the change in ice regime could be significant as well. And then, of course, you have the effects in the Saskatchewan River Delta down by the Saskatchewan-Manitoba boundary. And this is the largest freshwater delta in North America. And it's, some 10,000, um, I want to say acres. I've lost my units. I can't remember. But at any rate, it's the largest in North America. And of course, it's home to many species. It's also home to First Nations people as well. So that's a very significant issue in its own right. And then if you turn to what I call the recipient basins, again, changing the flows in the Capel system, could lead to changes in riparian habitat and the same ecosystem loss as we talked about for the areas downstream of Gardner Dam. There's also a wetland loss, and you might say, well, how does diverting water lead to more wetland loss? But if you have irrigation canals throughout the countryside, it's very easy to run a furrow to a canal and drain a wetland into it. And so it prompts wetland loss in that respect. And this, by virtue of moving water around, you have potential issues with erosion and mobilizing nutrients and contaminants and all of those kind of issues. And all of these environmental effects, I should rush to say, I'm not saying they'll all take place. It's just these are the things you have to consider when you're developing a project like this. And without considering these things, you're actually operating in the dark, so to speak. So don't get me wrong in saying that all of this will happen, but some of it definitely will happen. And there are a lot of challenges in doing a thorough assessment of what might happen. And then there are other things that we need to worry about as well. And part of this relates to Indigenous engagement. We speak of reconciliation in this country, and we need to learn to walk the talk and all of those kinds of things. And, as I mentioned already, there's a significant Aboriginal Indigenous people in the Saskatchewan River Delta, and they live a fairly traditional lifestyle. They depend on hunting and trapping and fishing and so on to sustain their lifestyle. And then downstream in the Qu'Appelle Valley, there are quite a large number of First Nations in that area, and they also tend to live a fairly traditional lifestyle. And so this consultation with Indigenous people, taking their concerns into effect is a non-trivial problem in developing this project. And then secondly, there are also interprovincial consequences. Part of the Saskatchewan Delta is in Manitoba, so there's that effect. But there's also a question of power generation in Manitoba. And when I said that Lake Diefenbaker's or the economic value of Lake Diefenbaker, the largest item, is hydroelectricity generation. That's only hydroelectricity generation in Saskatchewan. That's not taking into account the hydroelectric generation all the way to Hudson Bay. So this becomes a significant loss to the system. And then I think there are other issues related to water quality in the Qu'Appelle River, because if the Qu'Appelle system changes with irrigation development, then those consequences end up downstream and affect Manitoba as well. So there's a need for interprovincial consultation on this project, as well as public consultation within Saskatchewan. And just to give you a snapshot of where I think we are right now in this project development, the engineers involved talk about pre-project engineering. And in my day, I'm an old engineer. We used to call that feasibility studies. But we know that the province is in effect announced it's made to sound like a done deal. And so the pre-project engineer, I call it sort of a scoping and that sort of thing. And they're spending tens of millions, depending on how you look at the numbers. It's anywhere from 10 million up to towards 100 million, or 20 million up towards 100 million. And there's talk of finishing these studies around the end of August. And you'd like to think at that time there'd be a document that would say, here's what we looked at, here's the economic aspects of it, here are the costs associated with it, here's the material that should be included in a thorough environmental assessment. I'm not convinced that that's what we'll see at the end of August, but could be a pious hope. The other thing that I find at current is that there are low-key consultations going on, but they tend to be, in one sense, just preaching to the choir. They're talking to the people that they think might want this project, and I haven't seen any reach out to those that are might be concerned about this project development and where it's going. So I think that's another part of what's going on right now. And then there's a third element, and there's at least some talk with this project of trying to interest the Canada Infrastructure Bank in taking it on and providing federal funding. Now, Canadian Infrastructure Bank is supposed to invest in viable projects, and I'm not so sure that they might give a loan to a project like this. I don't know that they would actually cost share a project like this, but in any event, if they did their thorough economic analysis, I think they would come to the kind of conclusions that I tend to come to. But that's out there, and it's something we should be aware of. So in conclusion, I'd just like to summarize by saying this project has public policy, economic, and environmental consequences, and we need to understand all of those and do a comprehensive study of the environmental impacts, which includes the public policy and economic aspects. And I really think that the way to move forward on this, if they want to proceed, would be to establish terms of reference for a comprehensive environmental impact study with public consultation. We've seen many cases where project proponents have produced an impact statement that doesn't cover the full scope of the project. And I could see this happening in this case as well, where you'd get a study that doesn't really include everything. The other thing, of course, is that I'd like to see a federal environmental impact assessment anyway, but certainly if there's federal financial support in this project, it should be contingent on a federal environmental assessment review. And I think that's the key thing to keep in mind as this moves along. So that kind of concludes my remarks. I think we have a good bit of time for questions and discussion, but I'd certainly be willing to try to answer questions you might have. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
So Dixie, I don't know if you want to manage questions or if, you know, Bob did pose a bunch of questions during his talk to all of us. And I think there's a lot of good questions in there of the value of to farmers of this and especially all the dryland farmers. But there were many questions posed and I'm wondering if people might want to chime in.
Murray, are you going to field the questions?
I can do that. I see that I can get in and out fairly easily.
Okay.
I think there's not much background noise in my, is there much background noise?
No, I think you're fine, Murray.
Okay. I guess Bob has hit on one of the ones that I think the NFU and certainly Darren had a piece on this as well, is it's a tremendous amount of money going to a small group of people. I think that there's also the other costs that go with it. And so when Bob was asking about alternative farm-related projects, I was wondering if anybody or if any of the farm groups out there, and I also know that there's a large group of farmers in Ontario that are concerned with dams and diversions as well. So I just wondered if there was any group or individuals that had thought of alternatives to spending $4 billion on pumping water on the ground.
I guess we're looking for a response from us. What would you do if somebody offered $4 billion for your project? What would your project be?
Yeah,
that's the question.
That's it in a nutshell, really. I noticed there's one question from Stuart here too. So.
Oh yes, Stuart asked a question for Bob. Alberta wants to mine more coal in the Eastern Rockies. Are there heavy metals already coming from existing coal mines into Saskatchewan? And if so, what kind of increase might we see from the coal mines? Yeah, that's sort of an interesting one in there, and there is some discussion on that. Bob, do you want to?
Yeah, a couple of things I can comment on. First of all, the Prairie Provinces Water Board, which is the organization that actually monitors interprovincial water quality and water quantity, does gather water quality data at the Saskatchewan-Alberta border, and there's no specific amount of heavy metal or unusual amount of heavy metals coming in at the moment. And you know, the main concerns right now in those river crossings relate to nutrients and pesticides rather than metals. And but that said, the other thing that relates to the Alberta coal mines is that one of the serious challenges with those mines is the production of selenium out of those mines. Now, selenium isn't a metal, but it's a element that can cause considerable health effects and so on. And this is a challenge in Alberta now of kind of monitoring selenium output from coal mines. And I think this will be an ongoing issue. Thus far, there's no evidence of selenium in any quantity coming across the Saskatchewan boundary. I was interviewed about this project, and again, I made the point that there needs to be an interprovincial connotation as well. And it's not enough for Alberta proponents of coal mines to talk to Albertans. They need to talk to Saskatchewan people as well.
Yeah, and I could just add that this is a concern of the Indigenous group as well. And then in Alberta, in the south, where I'm familiar with, they've also had a salt problem, and they also think that climate change may exacerbate that. Several of my friends have had to get out of irrigation because of salt. I have Cam Goff, Terry Bame, and Glenn Tate. So, Cam?
Great information, Bob. Thank you. A couple of questions. Maybe I'll just stick with one and then come back in if nobody else wants in. I'm curious about the numbers that you basically were quoting in regards to the amount of water that is available to Lake Diefenbaker. Now, Alberta is entitled to half of the flow of the river. And I'm wondering if the numbers you have quoted are basically ones that can you take into account the fact that Alberta may want more water, or have you already taken that into account where you're assuming that Alberta is going to take half and they won't be able to take any more than they already are? Because I would think that if you have a low flow year and Alberta is, entitled to half of what actually comes into the system, then those numbers would change coming into Saskatchewan if they end up actually increasing their irrigation, which they have been talking about over the last several months.
Yeah, I should say that this is something that's carefully monitored by the Prairie Provinces Water Board. And you could make an argument that if there are 4 molecules of water left in the system, Alberta would get 2, Saskatchewan would get 1, and Manitoba would get the other 1. But all said and done, in very dry years, Cam, like 2001, was the last really dry year. Alberta comes close to using the 50% of the natural flow that it's entitled to, but in a kind of a normal year, they're coming nowhere near to using their half. And again, I think it speaks to the challenge I mentioned about irrigation licenses. Like, no irrigator in Alberta wants to have a license that would only give them water in the good years, So the irrigation districts in Alberta have very senior water rights licenses that go back literally almost 100 years. And so those are very well-developed licenses, but it's based on a kind of a reasonable flow in the river. The other part of that is that Alberta has been very, very scrupulous in honoring the Prairie Provinces Water Board agreement. There's never been even a whiff over coffee of saying we should take more water because we're the ones that generate the water. And in effect, back in 1968, when this agreement was negotiated, Alberta said they were trading certainty of the future in water use for giving up some of that water. Because if they'd gone ahead unilaterally with a different approach, we'd end up in court cases every time there was an issue. Saskatchewan or even Manitoba might be suing them over some perceived water issue. And so Alberta quite honorably gave up half the water in exchange for having certainty in the other half. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And I ask myself from time to time, I can remember the 60s. They all say if you can remember the 60s, you weren't there, but I was there and I do remember them. And it's, I don't know if today that kind of arrangement would have been able to be set in motion, because water demands in the 60s weren't as great as they are now. But it's a key question. And certainly I could see in the dry years, Alberta will use their 50%, and you can be almost sure of that. And in the wetter years, there'll be more available.
There's a question along that line in the chat box that was after viewing the documentaries on water management worldwide and the disappearing of the water towers, that'd be the glaciers, due to climate warming. I'm wondering if there's been any thought on the sufficient water supply going forward. You sort of covered that. I just wondered if there was anything else with some of the stuff that Pomeroy has come up with.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, Erling. And we have the water towers in the eastern slopes of the Rockies. Make no mistake about it. As I mentioned, 80 to 90% of the water we see in the North and South Saskatchewan River comes from those mountains. So, when you harvest timber in those mountains, when you mine coal in those mountains, when you burn them up with forest fires, all of that affects the water we get. But the key driver is climate, and the best information now from the University of Saskatchewan is that on average, it could be slightly more water coming off those mountains. But we all know that that comes with a price, and that price is way more variability. And I think what we're going to find is that, the average becomes almost meaningless. What we have to be prepared for is more flooding and more drought in that flow off the mountains. And we need better skills on both those fronts to handle those extreme conditions. And but generally speaking, it has been considered, and at the current state of knowledge is that there could be a slight increase in the quantity of water coming off the mountains. The other part of that is that you have to balance that with where the water comes from, which is where it's generated. But then if you're a dryland farmer in Saskatchewan, that's the runoff from the land in the prairies is governed by sort of different physical processes. And for the moment, that also seems to be leading to more water. But there's at least a scenario that sort of 50 years from now, there could be less water. And so in the short term, again, the prairie landscape could have slightly more water on average with much more extreme conditions, but not a vast change in the average. And of course, the timing of that rain and the timing of that runoff in Saskatchewan is a real challenge for dryland farmers.
Okay, I have Terry, then Glenn, Wendy, and Joanne, and Lyle. So
I had written a comment, but I'm not very skilled at this. And put it forward, but I'll just say it then. It would seem to me with the model of agriculture that we're seeing in Western Canada and with the policy regime that we have, farm sizes are increasing somewhat exponentially. And unless there's some policy to move people back onto the land, I just wonder how much uptake there actually would be for these increased irrigated acres, because the management plan of these large farms is purely dry land, cover as many acres as fast as you can. And irrigation would require far too much management and commitment for the type of agriculture we're seeing unfold right now.
Yeah, that's kind of my take as well, Terry. And I have to thank Darren for this one, but when I was chatting with him once, he said, if you're a dryland farmer and someone offers you irrigation, the amount of investment you make in irrigation, you could buy another quarter. And so what would you do? Buy the other quarter or irrigate? And so those are kind of the challenges I see, and I'd really like to try to understand, what people really would do given this big irrigation development.
Just on that note, that's an excellent question, Terry. And I've been on both sides in the meetings, and the two groups don't meet at the same time. You talk to the irrigators, and they want to flood all of Saskatchewan. If it floods, they put in drainage ditches. So it's an interesting debate, and I think the NFU have really started maybe something that we can work on. Glenn.
Okay, thanks. assuming that this project would go ahead, that's about $4 billion, helping maybe 2% of the farmers in Saskatchewan. So one of the questions earlier was what would we look at for alternative projects? And I'm looking at projects that are going to help everyone. APAS has estimated that the lack of reliable high-speed internet costs rural Saskatchewan a little over $1 billion a year. Even if they stretch the numbers a little bit, it's still a huge cost. So if instead of irrigation to help 2% of the farmers invest in high-speed internet, which would help 10, 20, 50% of the farmers make a little more money. Rural infrastructure in general, everything from air ambulances to short-line railways, bring the buses back so I can get parts delivered to my local store instead of having to drive 100 miles to get it. Anything. Saskatchewan, we're stacking up money in the bank at the Saskatchewan Development Commission because there are not enough research facilities to spend money in to develop new varieties of grain. And they say the varietal development in wheat returns about 20 to 1. We just don't have a place to spend it. So if instead of $4 billion for water, we'll develop a laboratory and help everybody. The list of alternative projects that will return more and return it faster is almost endless. That's just a statement.
Yeah. Oh, that's kind of where I'm coming down. It's nice to have it verified by someone that's actually been there. And I should say I married a farmer's daughter, but I'm a city boy through and through. So
There was a corollary to your question, or to your observation, Glenn. Stuart was asking whether APAS is going to oppose the irrigation project.
They were full steam in favor right off the bat, and I've talked to a few of the guys, and they're now kind of qualified in their support for it. They've toned it down a bit. Still in favor, I believe, but much more metered.
Not that public yet. Okay,
No.
Wendy?
Hi, so I'm right in the middle of that area one, like the west side wheat farm there. And in 1988-89, a company did an inventory of the land, many quarters in that original area down by Macquarie. We had 3 quarters in that, and I've got the report, I kept it. And those 3 quarters, one tested poor for irrigation, and the next one tested fair, poor, and then one tested good. None of them tested excellent. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4. I think a fair amount of saline in some of them and a water table and so on. But so that was kind of the history of it. And we have that report. So coming to today, I've been kind of watching it because we're so local here. And I think that a lot of the talk, well, first of all, it's early theoretical enthusiasm is what I would call it. So I think we kind of need to wait a while here. But I noticed that Namaca, which Kathy Holsander was the company that had the feedlot okayed, however long ago that was, Stuart Thiessen, long ago, we protested it and it went through. The province okayed that feedlot. He ran a grain operation until this year. And then this last year, he started a feedlot, which at 5,000, he intends to go to 35,000 cattle in that feedlot on the east side of the river, southeast of Outlook. And what that has generated, and I talked to a young guy that's a friend of my kids who's got a little bit of irrigation on the east side. And when I ask him what he says, a couple of things, he's already concerned because the province had changed the irrigation agreements with the farmers on the east side. He's not sure if it's affordable. I asked him, did he think there was anything good about it? And he talks about forage. And so this was mentioned earlier. Nobody's talking about vegetables. And in fact, one of the growers at one time that did potatoes has said, the potato industry is somewhere else and some of the vegetable stuff is just not happening. So people, I think, are thinking about forage and things like that. So I would say that that young irrigator would be very curious about what it looks like on paper for a cost. And I think Darren Qualman's comment that, you know, nobody in dry land here is thinking about doing that irrigation. So that's just a little bit of what's going on in the area.
Okay, and we only have 6 minutes left. And how many questions left?
Right now I have 4 more.
Okay, that gives us a minute a question.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay, I have Joanne.
Hi, well, I want to thank you very much for a comprehensive talk and one which really hits from a lot of different dimensions. I would bring back STC at 10 million a year. I guess that would be one of the things I'd be doing. But, you know, as a social scientist, I guess when we're talking about cost benefit analysis, we're always talking about who, you know, who's bearing the costs and who's reaping the benefits. And I know Wendy addressed some of this, and I had the same reaction that Terry did, but I'm also wondering about this changing land tenure situation in this province. And I know that that is relevant, at least partially in this area where we have so many large owners who are leasing land. And I'm wondering the degree to which people like Robert Angelic are poised to benefit from this. You know, who's pushing the project? Who's actually going to be, what's the energy behind it? And does this changing land tenure and changing size equation have something to do with it?
okay, Robert.
Yeah, it's a good point. I just take that as a comment, but I fully support the comment. It's, you know, who benefits, who gains, and people that have thousands of acres of land were very willing to, you know, irrigate part of it. You know, and of course, if they irrigate part, they still got thousands of acres of dry land farming. So that take-up question is really critical to me.
Okay, next.
Okay,
To me, it's going to have an impact on land values in a way that is also important to investigate.
okay. Couple of, or Lyle?
Yes, thanks so much for that presentation, Bob. I've found it very interesting, you know, and especially your history of all the other attempts to kind of flog this horse. I just wondered if you had any anything you wish to share about a possible hidden agenda or backstory, because clearly there's been a history of unused and unwanted irrigation, which you laid out very clearly. And as we know, the Highgate Dam proposal in the mid-late 2000s in near North Battleford, we had the same, we're puzzling, scratching our head about who wanted this darn thing besides the consultants that were, and the builders. And as it turned out, a couple of years later, even after it got turned down or kiboshed by Golder Associates, really pointed out all the things that the public was saying was it wasn't needed and wasn't wanted. Well, it turns out Bruce Powers showed up and wanted to build a nuclear power dam and was looking for a huge reservoir of water. So I'm just wondering if you see any kind of hidden agendas on this, because we've heard about the hopes for big solution potash mines in southeast Saskatchewan, where the southern diversion will become very close to. We know about the perennial American interest in our fresh water. So I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to share on those topic. Thanks.
Not really, but there's one, you raised an important point, which I should emphasize, that there's no earthly reason for more water, you know, to be diverted for anything other than irrigation. The potash mines don't need it. Industries in Regina don't need it. Nobody needs any of this water for any other reason. And I've looked at that very, very carefully. In terms of a hidden agenda, I find that the people that support irrigation that I've run into tend to be what I'd call true believers. Like they really think this is going to work, but I don't know of anything that you know, would constitute a hidden agenda as such. But there could be something out there, but I don't know of it.
I
Thanks.
have two more questions, Dixie. Do we have time?
No, who else is, we've only got about a minute left. So.
I've got Katie and Kathy.
Okay, very quickly, Katie and Kathy.
Thank you. This was more a comment on the choice of this subject matter being so important to talk about between, the federal government looking at forming a new Canada Water Agency, water now being traded as a commodity on the Chicago Exchange, the issues around Site C, Muskrat Falls, and of course, Lake Diefenbaker. The NFU being involved in the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes, climate change and droughts. I'm really impressed with the thoughtfulness and concern that members across the country are paying attention to monitoring water issues. And I think generally Canadians get too complacent about our water. We've been told for so long that we have all the water in the world here. And I'm just really impressed with the attention that our general membership is paying to this issue.
Good.
Okay,
And moving on to Kathy.
I'll take that as a compliment or as a comment and go to Kathy.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention about, the promotion of vegetables and processing. And this is something that the Barton report has talked about. The Barton report is also called Unleashing the Potential of Agriculture. This is kind of a unofficial, well, actually it's more of an official, but covert agenda of the federal government to promote massive exports in agriculture. But one of the things that Barton talked about was increasing food manufacturing and processing. And it's contradictory, because if you're trying to increase exports, you're trying to reduce prices to compete globally with other countries, producers that are trying to serve the same market. And processing, it's one of these carrots that they hold out that you never get to, because processing makes sense where it's close to the market and close to a labor source. And the edge of Lake Diefenbaker doesn't look like that. It's not a population center, and there's not a lot of labor there. So that's PR. There's no possibility that there's going to be a large processing sector for vegetables on Lake Diefenbaker.
Right, thank you. Moving to Murray, maybe you could give the thank you.
Yes, well, first of all, thank Bob. And you may not know it, but Bob understates things so that if this is a problem, it's a real problem. And he's not exactly like me, who tend to get over the top. He's understated. And so this really is an issue. And some of us think it's a national issue, much like Kathy and Katie have discussed. So we'll see where it goes. I know that people on the NFU have done a really good job, and we thank Bob for bringing some of the up-to-date data to the table so it can be used. And in appreciation, the National Farmers Union have gifted Bob with an associate membership for the year, and hope that we can continue the conversation. Thank you kindly and appreciate it.
Thank you all, and I hope to see you all again in one form or another. So thanks again, and have a good rest of the day.